Don't sign a single thing until you know what your husband was trying to protect. The voice came from somewhere behind me just as I reached for my car door, and for one strange second, with the cold brass handle in my hand and the morning wind tugging at the hem of my coat, I thought I had imagined it. I turned slowly in the parking lot of my building, one hand still resting on the door, and saw a woman standing near the edge of the curb with a paper cup in one hand and a grey wool coat hanging loose from her narrow shoulders. Her hair was thin and white, pinned back carelessly, and her face was weathered in the way only time and disappointment can shape it. At first glance, she looked like someone most people would pass without seeing. The kind of woman people lowered their eyes to avoid. But she was looking directly at me, and there was nothing vague in her expression. She knew exactly who I was. "Mrs. Harper," she said again, her voice steady this time. "If Vanessa puts papers in front of you today, don't sign them." My fingers tightened around the car handle. For a moment, I simply stared at her. It was 9:30 in the morning. I was already late for the inheritance meeting my daughter-in-law had insisted could not wait another day. My husband had been dead for 12 days. 12 days since the funeral. 12 days since I'd stood beside a polished oak casket and accepted casseroles, sympathy cards, and carefully rehearsed condolences from people who spoke of Richard like they had known him better than I had. 12 days since my son Daniel had started avoiding my eyes and Vanessa had begun speaking to me in the bright, efficient tone women use when they've already decided what your life should look like next. I should have gotten into the car. I should have thanked the woman with a polite smile and driven away. But there was something in the way she said my name that rooted me where I stood. "Do I know you?" I asked. She took one step closer, just enough for me to see that her shoes were worn through at the toes and her gloves didn't match. "No," she said. "But your husband knew me. And if he'd had another week, I doubt your daughter-in-law would have scheduled this meeting at all." My breath caught so sharply it felt almost embarrassing. Across the lot, a delivery truck rumbled past. Somewhere behind me, a horn sounded. The city moved around us in ordinary rhythm, but something inside me had gone very still. "What meeting?" she asked, though the look in her eyes told me she already knew. "The attorney's office," I said carefully. "About my husband's estate." She gave the faintest nod, as if I'd confirmed something she had expected. "Then listen to me very carefully. Whatever Vanessa tells you today, she is not trying to help you. She's trying to finish something." The words landed with a quiet force that made my stomach tighten. Vanessa had spent the last week speaking in soft practicalities. Probate. Transfers. Efficiency. Signatures. Every sentence delivered with sympathy folded neatly over urgency. She had arranged the appointment with Richard's attorney herself. She had offered to drive me, then seemed disappointed when I told her I preferred to go alone. I had noticed that. I had noticed more than I'd said. "Who are you?" I asked again, and this time my voice came out lower. The woman studied me for a moment, then reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small brass key. It rested in her palm, dull with age, attached to a faded blue tag with a unit number written in black ink. She stepped forward and pressed it into my hand before I could stop her. Her fingers were cold and dry. "Your husband left something behind," she said. "Something he knew she'd never stop looking for if she thought it was money. It isn't." I stared down at the key in my palm. "Storage Unit 214. West End Storage. 3 miles from downtown. Why are you giving me this?" I asked. Her eyes held mine, clear and unsparing. "Because he ran out of time," she said. Then she glanced past me toward the street, toward the life I had been about to continue as if none of this had happened. "And because if you walk into that office unprepared, you'll leave it with less than your husband intended." I looked back at her then, really looked. Not at the coat. Not at the paper cup. At the composure. At the certainty. At the strange dignity of someone who had already lost too much to waste a word. "Who are you?" I asked for the third time. She gave me a sad, almost private smile. "The woman they made invisible," she said. "And if you're wise, Mrs. Harper, you won't let them do the same to you." I stood there for several seconds after she walked away, the brass key cold against my palm and my heart beating with the slow, uneasy rhythm of something shifting just beneath the surface. By the time I looked up again, she had already crossed the corner and disappeared into the current of downtown foot traffic, folded so neatly into the morning crowd that I could have convinced myself she had never been there at all if not for the weight in my hand. I looked at the key again. West End Storage. Unit 214. The attorney's office was 15 minutes away. West End was 12 in the opposite direction. I should have gone straight to the meeting. That was the sensible thing. That was what the woman I had been for most of my life would have done. Show up on time. Sit quietly. Be agreeable. Sign what was placed in front of me and trust that grief made everyone seem colder than they meant to be. But Richard had been dead less than 2 weeks, and already I had begun to recognize the difference between sorrow and strategy. Vanessa had not cried once at the funeral. She had dabbed the corners of her eyes with a tissue, yes, and lowered her voice when guests approached, but her grief had always seemed polished, rehearsed, arranged like the pearl earrings she wore to the service. Daniel had stood beside her in a dark suit that no longer fit him properly, his shoulders bent in that familiar way they did when he wanted to disappear from conflict without leaving the room. He had hugged me too quickly, held my hands too briefly, looked over my shoulder when I spoke. I had spent 12 days telling myself that grief made people strange. But grief did not explain why Vanessa had changed the subject each time I asked for copies of Richard's paperwork. Grief did not explain why Daniel had suddenly begun saying things like we need to simplify and you do not want the burden of all this at your age. Grief certainly did not explain why my husband's attorney had not called me directly once. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, but I did not start the engine. Instead, I sat in the stillness of the car with my purse in my lap and the key resting in the center of my hand. Richard and I had been married for 41 years. Long enough to know the cadence of each other's silence. Long enough to understand what the other meant by what was left unsaid. My husband had never been careless. Not with money. Not with records. Not with trust. He kept warranties in labeled folders, tax returns in dated boxes, and every important document in the same locked file cabinet in his study for nearly 3 decades. He believed in order. In paper trails. In preparation. If he had left something behind, he had done it for a reason. And if a stranger knew that before I did, then the day ahead was no longer about paperwork. It was about timing. I took out my phone and opened the last text Vanessa had sent me 40 minutes earlier. Just a reminder, Evelyn. We should begin promptly at 10. Mr. Bell has another client after us, so it is important we keep things moving. No sympathy. No softness. Just urgency in a silk blouse. I read it twice, then set the phone back in my purse and turned the key in the ignition. West End Storage sat on the far edge of downtown in a narrow industrial strip lined with auto shops, chain-link fencing, and faded brick buildings that looked older than they should have still been standing. I passed the attorney's office exit and kept driving. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but I could feel something unfamiliar rising beneath my ribs. Not panic. Not fear. Clarity. By the time I pulled into the storage lot, it was 9:58. The building was plain concrete and steel, with a flickering sign above the office and rows of numbered units stretching behind it like sealed compartments in someone else's memory. I parked near the side entrance and sat for one last moment with my hand on the ignition. If this was nothing, I would still be late to the meeting. Vanessa would be annoyed. Daniel would look embarrassed. Mr. Bell would sigh in the discreet, expensive way attorneys do when widows complicate efficiency. But if this was something, then being late might be the first wise decision I had made in 12 days. Inside the front office, a young man in a navy polo glanced up from behind a computer and asked if I needed help. I placed the brass key on the counter between us. Unit 214, I said. I need to access it. He looked at the tag, typed something into the system, then paused. His eyes flicked once to the screen and back to me. Are you Evelyn Harper? He asked. The question landed quietly, but not casually. Yes, I said. He studied me for 1 second longer, then reached beneath the counter for a clipboard and a ring of keys. We have been expecting you, Mrs. Harper. The young man's tone was polite, but something in it made me stop with my hand still resting on the clipboard. Not surprise. Not curiosity. Recognition. He had not asked for identification. He had not asked whether I was the account holder. He had asked if I was Evelyn Harper the way one asks a question they already know the answer to. I looked at him more carefully then. He could not have been older than 25, clean-cut, narrow tie, polite in the practiced way of someone trained to avoid trouble. But there was a tension around his eyes that did not belong in a storage office on a Tuesday morning. "Expecting me?" I asked. He nodded once, then slid the clipboard toward me. The account was prepaid for 18 months. Instructions were left on file. If anyone other than you came asking for Unit 214, we were to deny access and notify legal. If you came in person, we were to let you in immediately and give you this. He reached beneath the counter again and pulled out a sealed white envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's handwriting. I knew it before I even touched it. My husband's script had always leaned slightly to the right, neat and measured, every letter controlled. He wrote like a man who believed words should not be wasted. Just seeing it made something tighten low in my chest. For 12 days, I had been surrounded by signatures, forms, sympathy cards, and legal notices. Nothing had unsettled me the way 7 letters in my husband's hand did. Evelyn. No flourish. No sentiment. Just my name. I took the envelope and signed the clipboard without looking down. The young man gave me the access key and pointed toward the rear corridor. Second row, left side. Unit 214 is at the end. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and cold metal. My heels sounded too sharp against the concrete floor as I walked past rows of locked doors, each one the color of old steel, each one holding some private version of someone else's unfinished life. By the time I reached the last unit, my pulse had settled into something quieter and more deliberate. I unlocked the latch, slid the metal door upward, and stood still. The unit was not full. That was the first thing I noticed. It was organized. Deliberate. Nothing tossed. Nothing abandoned. Inside were 6 archival boxes stacked neatly against the left wall, 1 legal file case on top of a folding table, and a banker's lamp plugged into the outlet beside it. Someone had set this place up not to store things, but to review them. To work. To prepare. On the table sat a black ledger, a manila folder, and a second envelope. This one was smaller. On the front, in the same careful handwriting, Richard had written, "If you are reading this, then Vanessa moved faster than I expected." I closed the unit door behind me before opening it. My fingers were steady now. Too steady. I slit the envelope with my thumb and unfolded the letter inside. "Evelyn, if this reached you, then I did not get the time I thought I had. I need you to read everything before anyone places a document in front of you. Do not let Vanessa control the order of what is seen. Do not let Daniel speak for you. Trust paper. Trust dates. Trust what people tried to hide when they thought you were not looking." I read that part twice. Do not let Daniel speak for you. There was no softness in it. No attempt to protect me from what he had already understood. Only instruction. Richard had always been gentlest when he was most certain. I kept reading. 3 months ago, I began reviewing discrepancies in the family accounts after noticing transfers tied to Shell holdings I did not authorize. At first I believed it was clerical. It was not. Vanessa has been moving money through Daniel's access and using my illness as cover for urgency. I did not confront her directly because I needed proof before accusation. Daniel knows enough to be ashamed and not enough to be innocent. I lowered the page and stared at the far wall of the unit until the words settled into place. Outside, somewhere beyond the metal door, I could hear the dull hum of a passing forklift and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Everything in the world continued exactly as it had an hour ago. But the shape of my life had changed. I looked back down at the letter. If Maggie reached you first, listen to her. She lost more than employment for refusing to cooperate. What was done to her was efficient, legal, and deliberate. That line stayed with me. Efficient, legal, and deliberate. It sounded less like a warning than a diagnosis. I set the letter down and opened the manila folder. Inside were bank statements, transfer logs, amended trust drafts, signatures flagged in yellow, and a chronology typed in Richard's hand. Dates. Amounts. Corporate names. Withdrawal patterns. There was no chaos here. No emotional plea. Only evidence arranged by a man who knew exactly how little truth mattered once the wrong person controlled the room. I sat down in the folding chair beside the table and began reading the way Richard would have wanted me to read it. Slowly. Line by line. No assumptions. No emotion until the pattern revealed itself. The first set of documents was not dramatic. That was what made it dangerous. Nothing screamed theft. Nothing looked reckless. The numbers moved in clean increments through respectable accounts with forgettable names. Consulting fees. Asset repositioning. Temporary liquidity adjustments. Administrative reallocations. Language designed to pass through a room unnoticed so long as everyone in it preferred convenience to scrutiny. Vanessa had not made the mistake of being greedy in obvious ways. She had been patient. She had moved in portions small enough to avoid alarm and often enough to become habit. $8,000 here. $12,000 there. Transfers routed through two holding companies Daniel had access to but almost certainly had not created himself. A line of withdrawals tied to household restructuring. Another tied to estate pre-distribution planning. It was all polished. Legal enough to survive a glance. False enough to collapse under attention. I opened the black ledger next. Richard's handwriting filled every page in tight, deliberate lines. Dates. Cross-references. Notes in the margins. Questions he had asked himself before he was ready to ask anyone else. He had tracked everything. Not only the money, but the timing. Vanessa's transfers increased after his diagnosis. They became bolder after his second hospitalization. They accelerated during the weeks he was too medicated to review his own correspondence without assistance. She had not stolen in secret. She had stolen in sequence. Always near distraction. Always near fatigue. Always when sympathy gave her the easiest access to the room. I turned another page and found notes that had nothing to do with money at all. Calendar entries. Missed calls. Changes in attorney access. Richard had marked the day Vanessa began requesting direct communication with Mr. Bell. He had marked the first time Daniel signed in his place on a routine transfer. He had marked the week our household financial summaries stopped arriving in the mail and began going to digital review only. I sat very still when I saw that. Richard had never switched to digital statements. He distrusted anything that left no paper behind. Which meant Vanessa had not merely moved money. She had changed the visibility of it. She had not hidden what she was doing. She had hidden how often I had the chance to see it. That realization settled over me with a colder weight than the figures ever could. Theft was one thing. Erasure was another. I opened the first archival box and found copies of household statements going back 5 years, all tabbed and dated. The second held trust drafts. The third held correspondence. In the fourth, beneath a stack of property assessments and insurance records, I found a thin folder labeled Maggie Quinn. I opened it and saw a professional headshot clipped to the inside cover. Same eyes. Same face. 15 years younger, composed in the way of women who had once worked in rooms where men relied on them and rarely admitted it. Margaret Quinn, Senior Financial Controller. Employed by Harper Development Group for 19 years. I read every page in that folder standing up. Maggie had not been an assistant. She had not been temporary staff. She had overseen internal accounting for nearly 2 decades and reported directly to Richard until 2 years ago, when she was removed after what company records called procedural conflict and structural downsizing. The phrase was so sterile it might have escaped notice if Richard had not attached his own notes beneath it. She challenged irregular transfers. Access revoked within 72 hours. Reputation compromised within 30 days. Housing lien accelerated 6 months later through subsidiary lender tied to shell account. I read that line twice. Then a third time. Maggie had not simply lost her position. She had been professionally isolated, financially cornered, and pushed out by the same machinery she had tried to stop. Efficient, legal, and deliberate. Richard had not been describing a personality. He had been describing a method. Beneath those records was one final note in his hand. I should have moved sooner. I underestimated how quickly Daniel began confusing loyalty with obedience. That was the first line in all of it that made me close my eyes. Not because it surprised me. Because it did not. Daniel had never been cruel as a boy. Weak, yes. Eager to please. Too easily led by the stronger will in the room. He had spent most of his life mistaking passivity for peace. Vanessa had not changed that in him. She had recognized it. Used it. Built around it. There is a particular kind of betrayal that does not arrive with raised voices or broken trust all at once. It arrives in permissions. In silences. In the steady transfer of authority from the person who earned it to the person most willing to take it. By the time I reached the last page in Richard's ledger, it was no longer possible to tell myself I had been excluded out of grief or concern. This had not been a family trying to simplify a widow's life. It had been a careful attempt to narrow it. I do not know how long I sat in that metal chair with Richard's ledger open in my lap and Maggie's file spread across the folding table beside me. Long enough for the fluorescent light above me to begin its faint electrical hum. Long enough for the morning to harden into noon. Long enough for my phone to vibrate 3 separate times inside my purse and for me to let each call pass unanswered. I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. Vanessa would have started with concern. Then moved to impatience. Then to control. By the third call, she would already be rewriting the inconvenience as evidence of my instability. I could hear her voice without answering. Soft. Efficient. Slightly breathless with false concern. Evelyn, we are all waiting. Mr. Bell has another appointment. We really do need to move this along. It was always the same trick. Create urgency. Narrow the room. Remove time. Make hesitation look like incompetence. I opened my purse, silenced the phone, and placed it face down on the table. Then I reached for the final archival box. Inside were copies of correspondence Richard had never shown me, arranged in chronological order and bound with black clips. Not love letters. Not confessions. Better. Documentation. Email printouts. Internal memos. Meeting summaries. Every polite exchange that had built the scaffold of what Vanessa eventually tried to call inevitability. There were threads between Vanessa and Mr. Bell that began nearly 8 months before Richard died. Friendly at first. Administrative. Clarifying trust language. Requesting drafts. Asking procedural questions she had no reason to be asking without Richard present. Then gradually more familiar. More direct. She began requesting revisions to estate language before Richard's second hospital stay. She framed them as streamlining. Protective simplification. Efficiency for Evelyn. The phrase appeared again and again. Efficiency for Evelyn. Reading it there, repeated in different emails over different months, I felt something inside me go very quiet. They had not only prepared to move assets. They had prepared the language of my consent. Every word chosen in advance. Every soft phrase designed to make surrender sound responsible. By the time Richard was too tired to sit through full meetings, Vanessa was already shaping what the room would sound like after he was gone. There were notes from Mr. Bell attached to several exchanges. Brief. Professional. Cautious in the way men are when they know they are crossing a line but believe paperwork will protect them. Client should review. Delay pending authorization. Recommend deferral. Then later, after Richard's final hospitalization, the tone shifted. Proceeding under family guidance. Family guidance. I almost laughed when I read it. Such elegant language for such ordinary betrayal. Beneath the email packet was a single yellow legal pad page in Richard's hand. Not dated. Written quickly. I know Belle sees what she is doing. I do not know whether he is complicit or merely cowardly. Plan accordingly. I folded that page once and set it aside. It was the first instruction in all of this that felt less like evidence and more like inheritance. Plan accordingly. Not forgive. Not endure. Not wait. Plan. I finally checked my phone. 4 missed calls from Vanessa. 1 from Daniel. A text from Vanessa sent 23 minutes earlier. Evelyn, this is becoming very difficult to explain. Please call me immediately. I stared at the sentence for a long moment. Not are you all right? Not we are worried. Not did something happen. Only this is becoming very difficult to explain. I read it again and felt, not anger, but clarity so clean it almost felt like relief. She was not worried about me. She was worried about narrative. About what my absence meant in a room she had already arranged. About what happened when the widow did not arrive on cue and the paperwork had to sit untouched beneath someone else's hand. I set the phone down and opened the black ledger to the final tab. At the back, Richard had assembled a chronology labeled "If delay becomes necessary." It was not emotional. It was tactical. A sequence of names, dates, calls to make, documents to request in person, copies to deliver. The first name on the list was not Daniel. Not Mr. Bell. Not even Vanessa. It was Margaret Quinn. Underneath her name Richard had written one sentence. She will tell you the truth without trying to preserve anyone's comfort. I closed the ledger and looked around the storage unit again, but it no longer felt like a place for hidden things. It felt like a room Richard had built for me to arrive in as one woman and leave as another. For 12 days I had been treated like an afterthought in my own life. Managed gently. Redirected politely. Spoken around. Prepared for reduction. But there is a difference between grief and surrender, and sometime between the first missed call and the last page in Richard's hand, I stopped confusing the two. When I stood, I did not feel steadier because the truth had made anything easier. I felt steadier because confusion had been replaced by sequence. I knew what Vanessa had done. I knew what Daniel had allowed. And for the first time since my husband died, I knew exactly why they were afraid of me being late. I gathered only what mattered. Richard's letter. The black ledger. Maggie's file. The printed email chain with Mr. Bell's notes in the margins. I left the rest exactly where it was, each box aligned the way Richard had left it, each paper returned to its place with the same precision he had used when he built this quiet insurance policy against his own absence. Before I locked the unit, I took one last look at the folding table and the banker's lamp and understood, with a strange and private ache, how much work my husband had done while pretending to be tired enough not to notice what was happening around him. Richard had not spent his final months in denial. He had spent them preparing. The realization was not comforting. It was clarifying. Outside, the noon air had turned warmer, the sky bright and indifferent above the chain-link fence and rows of storage doors. I sat in my car and called the first name on Richard's list. Maggie answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you would call," she said. Her voice was different over the phone. Less worn. Still tired, but steadier now that there was no need for performance. "I found the unit," I said. "I found everything." There was a pause on the line, not of surprise, but of recognition. "Then you know enough to stop being polite." I looked through the windshield at the bright concrete lot and let that settle. "I need you to tell me one thing before I decide what happens next," I said. "Did Richard trust you?" Her answer came without hesitation. Enough to know I would lose more by telling the truth than by staying quiet. I told it anyway. I believed her before she finished the sentence. Not because of the words. Because of the cost. Liars usually protect what they gained. Maggie had nothing left to protect except the truth. "Then meet me in 1 hour," I said. "Not at the office." I gave her the name of a hotel cafe 3 blocks from Bell's building, quiet enough for discretion, public enough for witnesses, expensive enough that Vanessa would never expect me to choose it. Maggie agreed without asking why. That, more than anything, told me Richard had been right about her. I started the car and finally called Daniel. He answered so quickly it was almost undignified. "Mom, where are you?" No greeting. No concern. Just strain. I could hear the pressure in his voice, the way he was trying to sound irritated instead of anxious. "Handling something your father left behind," I said. Silence. Then, Carefully, Vanessa said you never arrived. That is correct. Another pause. Longer this time. Mr. Bell has been waiting for over 2 hours. I almost smiled. Then perhaps Mr. Bell is learning patience. Mom. My name sat behind his teeth, restrained and tired. This is not the day to make things more complicated. It was such a familiar sentence. Not cruel. Not sharp. Just weak enough to sound reasonable. The language of a man who had spent most of his life hoping discomfort could be delayed into disappearance. No, Daniel, I said quietly. It is simply the first day. I am no longer willing to make them easier for everyone else. He said nothing. I let the silence remain just long enough to make him feel it. Tell Vanessa I will be in touch when I am ready, I said, and ended the call before he could hand the conversation back to her. I did not rush after that. I stopped at home first. Not to rest. To change. Grief had made everyone expect softness from me. I removed the dark wool coat I had worn since the funeral and changed into cream silk, pearl earrings, and the navy jacket Richard always said made me look impossible to dismiss. Then I sat at my vanity and studied my own reflection for a long moment. 12 days ago I had looked into that same mirror and seen a widow. Pale. Diminished. Too tired to imagine what came next. The woman looking back at me now was still grieving. But grief was no longer the most visible thing about her. By the time I arrived at the hotel cafe, Maggie was already seated in the corner with a cup of black coffee untouched in front of her. In daylight, clean and still, she looked less like a woman who had disappeared and more like a woman the world had decided to stop rewarding. She rose when she saw me, and for one brief second we stood facing one another in the strange silence of women who had both been underestimated by the same people for very different reasons. I sat across from her and placed Richard's letter on the table between us. Start at the beginning, I said. Maggie folded her hands, glanced once at Richard's handwriting, and gave me the kind of look women reserve for the moment comfort is no longer useful. Your daughter-in-law, she said, did not begin by stealing money. She began by studying who in this family could be moved without resistance. Maggie stirred the untouched coffee once, though she did not add cream or sugar, and watched the dark surface settle before she spoke again. Vanessa never chased money first, she said. Money was only ever the reward. Control was the objective. There was no bitterness in the way she said it. Only precision. The kind that comes after enough time has passed for anger to become structure. She spent her first year learning the architecture of your family. Who signed without reading. Who avoided conflict. Who wanted to be needed. Who could be flattered. Who could be made to feel old. I said nothing. Maggie did not need encouragement. She was not telling me a story. She was giving testimony. Daniel was simple, she continued. Not foolish. Not cruel. Just eager to be led by the person in the room who sounded the most certain. Vanessa figured that out almost immediately. She learned that if she spoke decisively enough, he mistook confidence for competence. Once she had that, she did not need him to understand anything. She only needed him to repeat what she said in rooms where his name still carried your husband's. I thought of Daniel at 22, standing in Richard's office after college in a suit he could not afford, nodding along to things he had not yet learned to question. Even then, he had always borrowed conviction from stronger people. Maggie was right. Vanessa had not changed him. She had simply recognized the most efficient use for him. And Richard? I asked. Maggie gave me a look that was not unkind. Your husband was harder. That is why she never moved against him directly until he got sick. She folded her hands over the table. Before that, she positioned herself as useful, helpful, organized. She solved small inconveniences no one else wanted to deal with. Rescheduled meetings. Streamlined paperwork. Handled details. It is remarkable how much authority people hand over to the person willing to make administration feel like kindness. I thought of every holiday Vanessa had quietly reorganized. Every family decision she had framed as practical. Every room she entered already holding a pen. Maggie continued. By the time Richard noticed the pattern, Vanessa was no longer asking for access. She was functioning inside it. She had already made herself part of the process. That is what made her dangerous. She never demanded control. She made everyone comfortable enough to stop noticing she had it. The waiter passed by and asked if we needed anything. I said no. Maggie did not look up. When Richard got sick, the pace changed, she said. Illness gave her the one thing competence always needs to become power. Urgency. Suddenly every delay could be framed as risk. Every question became emotional strain. Every signature became something that needed to happen now, before things became harder for everyone. I heard Vanessa's voice so clearly in that sentence it almost felt like she was seated beside us. Practical. Polite. Always one step away from impatience. And Mr. Bell? I asked. Maggie gave the smallest exhale. He told himself he was being efficient. Men like Bell almost always do. He did not need to be bought. He only needed to be flattered into believing convenience was professionalism. Vanessa made him feel indispensable. Important. She gave him plausible language and he gave her institutional cover. Family guidance. Efficiency for Evelyn. Proceeding under advisement. Every elegant phrase suddenly sounded exactly like what it was. Not law. Permission dressed in better tailoring. Did Daniel know? I asked, though by then I already understood the answer would be more complicated than innocence. Maggie held my gaze. Daniel knew enough times to ask fewer questions. That is how men like your son become useful to women like Vanessa. Not because they are malicious. Because they decide that discomfort is more dangerous than denial. That landed harder than everything else. Not because it was cruel. Because it was exact. I thought of all the years Daniel had confused avoidance with decency. All the ways he had mistaken silence for balance. Maggie reached into her bag then and removed a thin envelope, worn at the corners, and placed it between us. Richard asked me to keep this if anything happened before he could act. Inside was a copy of a revised trust amendment, unsigned, dated 6 weeks before Richard died. I scanned the first page and felt my pulse slow into something almost cold. Richard had already prepared to remove Daniel as acting authority, strip Vanessa from discretionary access, and transfer oversight to an independent executor pending formal review. He had seen enough. He had moved to stop it. He had simply run out of time. I looked up at Maggie. Did Vanessa know this existed? Maggie's expression did not change. No. She thought she was racing his grief. She never understood she was racing his certainty. For the first time that day, I smiled. Not because anything in front of me was kind. Because it was complete. Vanessa had built her advantage on timing. Silence, and the assumption that everyone in the room would continue preferring comfort to clarity. She had mistaken restraint for helplessness. She had mistaken grief for surrender. And now, for the first time since my husband was buried, I understood that what Richard left me was not merely evidence. It was sequence. And sequence, in the right hands, is how power changes rooms. By the time I rose from the table, the afternoon had settled into that quiet hour when expensive places become useful for private decisions. The lunch crowd had thinned. Glassware had been cleared. The room had softened into low voices and polished silence. I slid Richard's letter, the unsigned amendment, and Maggie's notes back into my leather portfolio and stood without hurry. Vanessa had spent months arranging rooms in her favor. That afternoon, I intended to choose my own. We are not going back to Bell's office yet, I said. Maggie nodded as if she had expected nothing else. Good, she said. He has had too much time to prepare his face. We left separately. That had been my suggestion. Not secrecy. Sequence. Maggie walked out first and disappeared into the flow of afternoon pedestrians. I waited 7 minutes, paid the bill, and called Mr. Bell myself from the hotel lobby. He answered on the second ring, his tone measured in the way men sound when they have spent the day rehearsing patience for someone they already consider inconvenient. Mrs. Harper, he said, warm in that practiced legal register that always seemed 1 degree removed from sincerity. We have been trying to reach you. I am aware, I said. I would like to reschedule our meeting for 4 o'clock. A pause. Brief. Controlled. Of course. We had hoped to conclude matters this morning. Then I imagine this afternoon will be disappointing. Silence met me on the line, just long enough to register. Then his voice returned, smoother now. More careful. 4 o'clock, then. I ended the call before he could reclaim the rhythm. Next, I called Daniel. He answered more slowly this time. Fatigue had entered his voice. So had strain. Mom. 4 o'clock, I said. Tell Vanessa not to leave. He hesitated. What is this about? I looked out through the hotel's glass doors at the city moving past in clean, indifferent lines. Your father, I said. Finally speaking in a room where no one can interrupt him. I ended that call as well. I spent the next 2 hours doing only what was necessary. I made 3 copies of every document at a private business center 6 blocks from the hotel. 1 set for Belle. 1 for Daniel. 1 for myself. Originals stayed with me. I arranged the pages in the order Richard had prepared, not in the order Vanessa would have preferred. That distinction mattered. She had built her advantage by controlling sequence. Today, sequence belonged to me. First the trust amendment. Then the email chain. Then the transfer logs. Then Maggie. Not because her story mattered least, but because by the time she spoke, no one in the room would still be able to pretend she was merely a woman with grievances. By then she would be what Richard had made her impossible to dismiss as corroboration. I arrived at Belle's office at 3:52. 8 minutes early. Not late enough to look apologetic. Not early enough to look uncertain. The receptionist looked up too quickly when I entered, relief crossing her face before professionalism returned to cover it. Mrs. Harper, she said, rising. They are expecting you. Of course they were. Vanessa was already seated when I entered the conference room. Cream silk blouse. Gold watch. Legal pad open. Pen aligned perfectly across the top margin. She had changed tactics in my absence. This morning she would have greeted me with concern. Now she rose with measured restraint and something more dangerous beneath it. Annoyance dressed as composure. Evelyn, she said, just warm enough for witnesses. We were beginning to worry. Daniel sat beside her, pale with the exhausted tension of a man who had spent too many hours trapped between dread and explanation. He looked at me once, quickly, then at the portfolio in my hand. That was the moment I saw it. Not guilt. Recognition. He knew, at least now, that whatever had delayed me had not been confusion. Mr. Bell stood as I entered, every inch the polished attorney. Calm tie. Controlled. Smile. Professional concern carefully measured into his posture. Mrs. Harper, he said. I trust everything is all right. I set my portfolio on the conference table and took my seat before answering. No, I said, folding my hands neatly in front of me. But it is finally organized. No one spoke. Vanessa smiled first, but too quickly. Perhaps we should begin with the signatures and address any lingering concerns afterward. She said it lightly, efficiently, the same tone she had used for months when trying to turn urgency into obedience. I looked at her then, fully, and saw what Richard had seen before I had. Not intelligence. Not elegance. Calculation sharpened by habit and mistaken for inevitability. No, I said again, calm enough that the word barely seemed to land before it changed the room. Then I opened the portfolio, placed 3 identical document sets on the polished wood, and slid one toward Mr. Bell, one toward Daniel, and one toward the empty chair beside me. Vanessa's eyes flicked to the extra copy. Just once. A small movement. But enough. Before we begin, I said, there is one more person whose absence has already cost this family enough. The door opened less than 5 seconds later. Maggie entered quietly, carrying nothing but her handbag and the kind of composure that comes from having already survived the worst thing a room like that can do to you. Vanessa did not stand. She did not speak. But I watched the color leave her face in one precise degree, like something carefully applied had begun to crack beneath heat. Daniel turned first toward Maggie, then toward me, confusion sharpening into something more dangerous. Recognition without context. Mr. Bell's expression shifted last. Not surprise. Recognition. That interested me most. Men reveal themselves most clearly in the half-second between being caught off guard and deciding which version of themselves to become. Bell did not look shocked to see Maggie. He looked inconvenienced. "Margaret," he said, too quickly. Maggie took the empty chair beside me and folded her hands on the table. "It has been a long time, Arthur." No one missed the absence of Mr. I let the silence sit there for one clean beat, then opened the first set of documents and turned to the trust amendment Richard had prepared 6 weeks before he died. "We will begin here," I said. Bell glanced down, and I watched the precise moment his face lost its practiced neutrality. Not dramatically. Men like him do not collapse in public. But his eyes paused one fraction too long on Richard's signature line and the paragraph beneath it. Acting authority removed. Discretionary access suspended. Independent review required. Daniel read more slowly. Vanessa did not touch her copy at all. "This draft was never executed," Bell said carefully, recovering first. "It is not legally binding." "No," I said. "But it is legally clarifying." I turned to the next page. "It establishes intent, which becomes relevant the moment timing and access enter question." Bell said nothing. That silence was answer enough. I slid the email chain forward next. Vanessa's requests. Bell's replies. Efficiency for Evelyn. Proceeding under family guidance. Draft revisions initiated before Richard's final hospitalization. Daniel read the first page, then the second, and by the third he stopped pretending to scan and actually began reading. That was when his breathing changed. Small. Uneven. The sound of a man discovering his own name had been used more often than his judgment. Vanessa finally reached for her copy then. "This proves nothing," she said, too quickly. "Administrative planning is not misconduct." "No," Maggie said, calm as winter. "But restructuring visibility before removing consent is." Vanessa turned toward her with the brittle smile of a woman who had spent years confusing poise for invulnerability. "You were terminated for cause." Maggie did not blink. "I was removed for refusing to sign off on transfer patterns you called temporary and Richard later called theft." Bell closed his file. Not hard. Just decisively enough to suggest control. "Mrs. Harper, if this meeting is now adversarial, I would advise you have been advising for 8 months, I said, and for the first time since entering the room, Arthur Bell stopped speaking because someone else had finally used the right tone. Not louder. Not sharper. Simply finished with him. I placed Richard's ledger in the center of the table and opened it to the chronology. Dates. Transfers. Access changes. Hospitalizations aligned beside withdrawal patterns. Daniel stared at the pages as though the numbers might rearrange themselves into innocence if he waited long enough. They did not. "I did not know all of this," he said finally, and there it was. Not denial. Not outrage. The smaller, thinner thing beneath both. The plea of a man who had mistaken partial knowledge for moral shelter. Maggie answered before I could. "No. You only knew enough times to stop asking." Daniel flinched harder at that than he had at any document. Vanessa leaned forward then, voice tightening at the edges. "This is absurd. Richard was ill. He was suspicious. He was not thinking clearly near the end. It was the first real mistake she had made all day. Not the accusation. The timing." Bell looked at her then, sharply, because even he understood what she had just done. She had challenged Richard's competence in a room full of his paperwork. I slid the final document across the table. Maggie's file. 19 years of service. Revoked access. Accelerated housing lien. Shell lender alignment. Efficient, legal, deliberate. Vanessa read the first page and did not turn the second. She did not need to. She already knew what was on it. Bell removed his glasses. Daniel said nothing at all. And in that silence, with every elegant phrase stripped down to sequence, the room did what rooms like that always do when truth finally arrives with better documentation than power. It changed allegiance. No one apologized. I did not ask them to. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. By the time I closed the portfolio and stood, Vanessa had lost access, Belle had lost discretion, and Daniel had lost the luxury of believing passivity was the same thing as innocence. Richard had left money, yes. Property. Holdings. Structures. But none of that was what steadied me when I walked out of that room. What he had really left me was something far more useful. He left me the order in which to tell the truth. And once I did, everything they had built to contain me collapsed under the weight of its own paperwork.